Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you to the September 12th meeting of the General Obligation Bond Environment and Sustainability Subcommittee meeting. I hereby call this meeting to order. We have interpreters today to provide Spanish translation. Would you please introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, my name is Elsie Duarte, and along with my colleague Carmen Cota, we will be servicing as interpreters in today's meeting. I will now introduce myself to our Spanish-speaking audience and review some guidelines. Buenos días, mi nombre es Elsie Duarte y junto con mi colega Carmen Cota estaremos sirviéndoles como intérpretes en la reunión de hoy. Al momento de hacer un comentario público, de favor les pedimos que hable despacio, con claridad y deténgase después de cada pocas oraciones para interpretarle de la manera más completa posible. Gracias. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So today there will be a public comment period during item 3 on today's agenda, and the public comment period will be up to 30 minutes in length. Speakers will have 2 minutes to comment. However, prior to the start of the public comment period, I may specify a briefer duration based on the volume of speakers. If you are attending in person and would like to speak, you need to sign up to speak at the kiosk located at the entrance to the council chambers before item number 3 begins today. For virtual participants, registration to speak must be submitted 2 hours prior to the start of each meeting. Speakers will be called in order received, beginning with virtual participants. Moving on to our meeting agenda for today, our first agenda item is approval of minutes of the last meeting. Do I have a motion for approval of our previous meeting's minutes?
Madam Chair, I'll move to approve the minutes as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Chachal. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I would like to know if there is any discussion on the matter of approval of the meeting minutes. Hearing no discussion, all those in favor of approving the meeting minutes, please say aye.
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 Thank you. And all those opposed, please say nay. Hearing none opposed, is there anyone that is abstaining from voting? Thank you. The motion passes. Our next agenda item is introductory remarks. So during this meeting, we will be going over follow-up items from our first meeting. The subcommittee has received comments from the public, and members have our own vision of priority capital needs. So we will continue to receive more input from the public and from members today as well. The agenda packet includes a summary of the input provided by the public outside of these meetings. For example, residents have provided input in support of heat mitigation efforts, water conservation, and addressing deferred maintenance. There have been 90 resident submissions to the GeoPhoenix tool where residents provide their input on prioritized capital needs being reviewed by each subcommittee. For this subcommittee's projects, the HVAC and climate-controlled system efficiency improvements have the most support, followed by water and other energy efficiency improvements. As our subcommittee hears presentations and public comments today, I will ask members to keep in mind that we have limited time to reach our recommendations. We are tasked with identifying a prioritized list of projects to recommend to the executive committee no later than the last scheduled subcommittee. There will not be additional meetings scheduled. And as a reminder, this is meeting 2 of our 4 total meetings for this subcommittee. The city has not had a GeoBond program since 2006, and significant infrastructure needs that exceed the $500 million scope approved by the City Council. The subcommittee should also consider projects at a higher priority that would ensure city facilities and infrastructure can continue to be accessible and safe for operation. We have 2 meetings after today to finalize a prioritized list of project recommendations to the Executive Committee. No later than the 3rd meeting, the subcommittee will need to have a list of projects identified, and no later than the 4th meeting, those projects will need to be ranked in priority order, concluding with a final report to the Executive Committee. To assist our subcommittee with prioritizing projects, staff has developed a method for facilitating discussions on prioritization and will brief us today on that process following the next agenda item. Finally, the city has scheduled a public hearing for the Executive Committee on September 14th at 6 p.m. I believe that is on a Wednesday of this week, for the purposes of engaging the public and to hear comments regarding the overall bond program. I would encourage you all to listen to that meeting or watch the video posted on the GeoBond website at your earliest convenience so you can hear the feedback received from residents. Due to open meeting law requirements, subcommittee members should not plan to actually attend the meeting. Our next agenda item is for follow-up discussion and public comment regarding capital needs and discussion of the subcommittee's process for prioritizing those so-called capital needs. I will turn the meeting over to staff to respond to questions and requests from the last meeting. At the conclusion of the discussion on capital needs, we will have staff go over a possible method for prioritizing projects. And I want to thank staff in advance for all of the hard work that they have done over the past few weeks to prepare for this meeting, to answer many of our subcommittee members' questions from our previous subcommittee meeting in August. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. Welcome. Good morning to you. We are here to follow up on the discussion that you had at your first meeting and continue to answer any questions that you have. And so let me do a quick intro. I think folks know who we all are, but I just want to confirm. Of course, I'm Karen Peters, Deputy City Manager. To my right, go ahead.
Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. Chris Fazio, Deputy Budget Director.
And Mr. Benton from the Law Department.
Yes, David Benton, Acting Assistant City Attorney.
Okay, and then to my left.
Good morning again, Joe Giudice, Public Works Director.
Good morning all. Mark Hartman, Chief Sustainability Officer.
And good morning, Dave Hundula, Director of Heat Response and Mitigation.
Thank you. We want to just give you a quick overview again of the projects that we outlined at our first meeting, and I'll turn it to Joe to just walk through those, and then we'll get into some detail regarding some of the questions that were posed. So please go ahead, Joe.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. Good morning again, Chairwoman and members of the subcommittee. It's great to be here with you for our second meeting. Want to make sure we've got the presentation up. Okay, we can go to the first slide, please. I got it. Okay, so just a reminder of the 3 prioritized projects that were presented. The equipment replacement for energy and water efficiency project. Again, program, I should say, better describes this program. $5 million over the 5-year term of the bond program. Then $15 million for upgrading HVAC, climate control, and other energy efficiency investments. And then a little over $5 million in a fuel tank replacement program. Those were the 3 prioritized needs. And then in the future needs category, there were 3 programs: electric vehicle charging stations at $16 million, city brownfield redevelopment at $5 million, and heat resiliency at a little over $11 million. So at the last meeting, you all asked a lot of very probing questions, and I brought some reinforcements with me here today. Karen and I did. to try and answer those questions as best as we can. And so we'll go ahead and get started. First, with respect to the, and I'm really going to focus in on the two programs related to water and energy efficiency, as well as the program related to the HVAC replacements. I think most of the questions related to the fuel tank program were answered at the first meeting. If there are follow-ups, we're prepared to discuss those with you today. But there was a series of questions that kind of grouped together. One of the series of questions groupings was related to describing kind of the benefits. I think you all articulated that you understood the deferred maintenance priorities and recognized that the bond program was built around addressing deferred maintenance, but you wanted some more clarity on the benefits with respect to environment and sustainability from these programs, and so I'm going to endeavor to do that. With respect to like building automation systems investments, we went back and took a look, and we come in the range, and I've ranged these because these are programs, and each unique project would fall somewhere typically in these ranges. We're forecasting 10 to 30% reduced energy use, reduced greenhouse gas emissions with the installation of these building automation systems. When it comes to programs related to water cooling towers, so the example we presented at the first meeting was at the Sky Harbor Airport, some improvements to the water cooling tower infrastructure there. The water savings came in around 25%, which is significant in and of itself, and then considering the volume of water that's used in these cooling systems, it is a significant amount of water. As well, the chemical savings actually ranged in the 30 to 50% range with these, and there's marginal energy efficiency savings, probably 2 to 5% of additional energy efficiency savings. So it does hit all three. Obviously, water and chemical savings are most significant, but another benefit, and the chair asked us to make sure we talked about other benefits as well beyond just the very clear benefits. The life of these assets is forecast to last quite a bit longer as well. So these assets become more long-lived, more sustained for a period of time. With respect to the HVAC and other climate control equipment program, for roof-mounted units, we are forecasting a 10% energy savings and greenhouse gas emissions reductions associated with the replacement of those units. For chiller units, we're forecasting a 20% reduction in energy use and also in greenhouse gas emission reductions. And again, reminding you that these systems improve in reliability. We reduce the amount of times we're having to respond to repair broken systems, and it becomes rather just a maintenance circumstance. There was also a series of questions around equity, and again, as the chair pointed out at the first meeting, describe other benefits to these investments beyond just the very obvious tangible savings benefits. So many of our facilities that would be receiving upgrades under this program are in our core city area. So the older parts of the city where our buildings are older, that tends to also be an area of the city that is our most diverse in population and probably an underserved as well. And another major and important highlight, many of these facilities, they serve a core purpose like a library as well as a senior center, but they also serve as part of our cooling infrastructure for our community. People go there to seek relief from the heat during the summer, and the reliabilities of these systems are counted on by that city's cooling infrastructure for those citizens' comfort. Again, we would focus our investments on projects that deliver the highest and best value in terms of return on investment. I do not have, there were some questions about can we give specifics on return on investment. We would need project-specific information to be able to have that. What we can share with you is that we would endeavor to prioritize the projects that will both be in the core area, meet the deferred maintenance need, and deliver the return on investment within the life cycle of that equipment installation. With that, I am going to turn it over to Mr. Hartman, who is going to discuss our city vehicle electrification system.
Yes, good morning again. So certainly around the electric vehicle, there's really two slides I want to talk about. It was originally proposed $16 million in EV charging infrastructure. Primarily the most expensive part was the heavy-duty infrastructure, which we're really not sure exactly how much heavy-duty equipment we'll have by then, whether it's electric or hydrogen electric. And we really thought it was appropriate to kind of move it into the next period, would probably be when there's greater clarity around that. The funding was both for planning and implementation, and much of it also was anticipated we could meet it through much of the funding that's becoming available. Certainly, the states received over $76 million in grants for the high DC fast charging along a 1 mile corridor along our highways, and they're going to look at providing fast charging along with every cars within 50 miles. You'll be able to travel between charging stations. And the one we're most excited about, or I'm most excited about certainly, is the $1.25 billion in competitive grants that will be coming available over the next year. And we're really seeing that we'll have a strong case to kind of bring that forward, where we've got a good partnership with utilities and others to do some pretty competitive proposals, we think. And then the other one is actually, as departments are aware and recognize and planning their buying, we're really seeing it integrated in many of the capital projects that we're doing. They're starting to include EV charging infrastructure within them. And certainly we could see for immediate needs, if there was needs prior to the next bond cycle, we could do capital program upgrades to those particular ones, be met through that. The other one I wanted to say is regarding, that's kind of the infrastructure side, is that the whole planning around electric vehicles, implementation of the action plan put up forward by the ad hoc committee, made some 90 recommendations to the city of what we needed to do. And so we've kind of taken those. One of the items was certainly provide funding for a planning study, and that was in this year's budget cycle. As well, we've established, Joe and I are actually co-chairing a EV steering committee with 22 staff to look at implementing all 90 of the actions assigned to different departments. We have a tracking, and we're looking at everyone doing it, looking at which year they're going to complete those by. And that's that steering committee where really looking at how to make sure we're planning. And I think a lot of the input from that steering committee will really drive the next bond cycle of what other capital needs we might need. As well as within this current fiscal year, we've got 3 positions officially in our budget that are EV manager and Equity Vista and a fleets coordinator, all new positions that are helping to coordinate this implementation. And certainly we're going fast on our charging stations. We've got over 40 charging stations planned for this year that we're installing, just from departments excited and anxious and saying, hey, we'd really like to include and add this within our current efforts. So those kind of suppose both our planned hope for grants as well as current actions. I think we're really moving fast on the electric vehicle transportation infrastructure side. So we do see a definite need will be coming in the next budget cycle, but not necessarily, or bond cycle, but not this one. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation. We were asked to provide a little bit more context on the potential importance of this item, and a little bit about what the city has been doing recently, particularly with respect to urban forestry. Madam Chair, in your role as chair of the Urban Heat Island and Tree Shade Subcommittee, you've consistently spoken about the need to add more trees throughout the city and how important that investment is from the public's perspective. There is widespread recognition that too many of our city streets and sidewalks look like the picture on the right on this slide. This photo is taken from a stretch of Baseline Road near Cesar Chavez Park. The sidewalk you can see here is used by transit riders, school children, community members using the nearby park and library. But as you can see, at the time this photo was taken, there was essentially zero shade coverage as far as the eye could see. Trees are cooling assets for our community. They provide shade and cool the air via evapotranspiration and keeping surfaces cool and shaded. Neighborhoods in Phoenix and across the United States that have fewer trees tend to be hotter. And another unfortunate pattern exists in cities, including Phoenix, that these hot neighborhoods with fewer trees tend to be home to people with lower incomes and have higher percentages of people of color. It's also the case that these neighborhoods have higher rates of heat-related illness. The Phoenix of the future is one in which all neighborhoods reap the benefits of urban trees. Mayor and City Council articulated this vision last year in making a tree equity pledge with our nonprofit partners at American Forests. Public investment in trees and other cooling strategies in public spaces will be necessary to help us meet that commitment. To provide some context on the scale of investment that will be required, I've pulled some numbers from the American Forests Tree Equity Score map. This is a publicly available interactive web map, and a screenshot from it is what you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. Right now, the average neighborhood in Phoenix has a tree equity score of 80 on a 1 to 100 scale, 100 being good. That means that there are about 400 to 450 neighborhoods that are below that average of 80. And 80 is not where our goal is. With American Forests, the goal is to have all neighborhoods reach a score of 100. But for a thought exercise, we'll just imagine trying to bring all neighborhoods up to a score of 80, the citywide average. The American Forest Tool estimates that we'd need to add 460,000 trees throughout the city to bring all of our neighborhoods up to our current average of 80. Now, as you think about that number, it's important to recognize that that number includes both public and private spaces, and in most of our neighborhoods, the vast majority of the area is privately owned, not publicly owned, but public land is an important portion of the portfolio. Here's a look at the major public funding streams in urban forestry in Phoenix right now, and I recognize it's a busy slide and we might return to it for more conversation later. There are currently 5 major funding streams, and the table shows what those programs are, how much funding is allocated to them, how many trees that translates to, what the source of the funding is, and the focus areas for those investments. Generally speaking, what we're trying to do, in some cases more successfully than others, is take a data-driven, equity-focused approach to plant and maintain and grow trees in places in the city where they can provide the most benefits for people. And that includes the exact location we saw on the first slide, the stretch of Baseline Road near Cesar Chavez Park, where we planted with corporate sponsorship and partnership with American Forests 260 trees last April, and I believe several of you had your hands on shovels helping get those trees in the ground. 2 points from this table I'd like to draw your attention to. First, if we add up the number of trees planted per year in the first 3 rows, 1,800 plus 780 plus 1,500, that gets us to about 4,000 trees per year for public spaces from the general fund and from our capital improvement program. For the next 2 years, we'll also be planting in the neighborhood of 5,000 trees per year in residential neighborhoods, including on private property, with American Rescue Plan Act funding. Collectively, it's our understanding that we're investing more today in the urban forest in Phoenix than any time in the city's history. And with the Inflation Reduction Act and other pending items at the federal level, we're confident that that number is only going to continue to grow in the years ahead. And with that, I will pass the baton back down to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, that concludes the presentation that we had planned to respond to the questions and issues that were raised last time. We'd be happy to answer new ones to the extent that the subcommittee has any.
Thank you so much to staff for these presentations, and again for all of the work that went into the research to answer the questions that we asked at the last meeting. We will now open our public comment period regarding this item. Do we have any speakers registered today?
Yes, Madam Chair, we have 2 virtual and 2 in-house.
Okay, so we have 4 speakers registered today. I will give each speaker 2 minutes to speak. We will start with virtual participants first. When your name is called, your audio device will be unmuted and you may begin your remarks. At the conclusion of the virtual speakers, we will invite in-person attendees to the podium to address the committee. I will now ask the city attorney to explain the rule of public comment in GO Bond committee meetings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, members of the public may speak to comment on the general obligation bond program. City Code requires speakers to present their comments in a respectful and courteous manner. Profane language, threats, or personal attacks on members of the public, council members, committee members, or staff are not allowed. A person who violates these rules will lose the opportunity to continue to speak. The committee and staff cannot discuss or comment on matters related to pending claims or litigation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Staff, will you please call off the speakers?
Good morning. Our first virtual speaker will be Dan Pitton, followed by Karen Goff. Dan, are you on the line? Dan is not with us this morning. Next speaker is Karen Goff. Karen, are you on the line?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please proceed.
Good morning, members of the committee and staff. My name is Karen Goff. I'm director of the Applied Health Policy Institute at the Phoenix campus of the U of A. I apologize, I wasn't able to speak at the first meeting, but I would like to echo some of the comments that I heard from the committee members and the public about the importance of heat mitigation. My institute spends time studying public health as it relates to the built environment, and we've been looking at policy solutions to address the urban heat island effect in Phoenix. And I would really like to see the heat resiliency item added into the Go Bond package and prioritized. I have no doubt that the recommended items that staff put forward are important. But the good news is that we don't have to choose between the two because there are other funding sources available, particularly in light of the federal infrastructure bill. For example, the federal infrastructure bill created new green banks with quite a bit of money specifically earmarked for state and local governments to reduce greenhouse gas by leveraging low-cost private financing. So I think that there are some other good avenues for that. And I just want to emphasize that for the Sustainability Go Bond in particular, I would like to see investment in projects that directly impact the quality of life of constituents and improve the unique challenges that we face in Phoenix. And the projects that I've seen prioritized thus far contribute to sustainability much more indirectly, primarily through how our own city operations contribute to kind of the grand scheme of climate change. Whereas some of these items in the heat resiliency package, like the trees in particular, have more of a direct impact. The ideas behind the heat resiliency initiative are simple and evidence-based and have a big impact on equity. So I would like to see that added back in. Thanks.
Thank you. Our first in-person speaker in the upper council chambers will be Vanya Guevara. After that will be followed by Chaz Salazar.
Yekpena, buen dia. Vania Guevara with Chispa, Arizona. I am now a descendant of Guscatan, which is modern-day El Salvador. And I say that because it's very personal to me. It's recognizing my indigenous ancestry. I'm here today after a while because I'm very, very concerned about your prioritized list over the future needs list. I don't understand, or I think it's sort of contrary to what the city says and what we all believe to be in terms of us being in a climate crisis and really addressing heat. The fact that the prioritization of fleets and fuel tank replacement, specifically in South and West Phoenix, is very concerning. I think it's egregious and sort of a slap in the face to the communities I work with every day. It's important that we prioritize what is now currently on the future needs list, which is heat resiliency. We need to invest, please consider investing more in tree planting, cool corridors, figuring out technology that invests in electrification of public transportation and of all your city-owned, operated vehicles. I just want to urge you to really consider that. I don't know how far along staff has gone into doing the research and making these recommendations, but it just seems really backwards and really, really devastating for our community members to hear that we recognize, extreme heat is an issue. It's a leading cause of death among natural resources in the country. We have people in our communities that rely on public transit. They don't have the choice. They have to walk to work. They have to walk to school in degrees of upwards 110, 115 degrees. So I just want to remind you of that. I recognize some of you. I'm glad you're serving on this committee. I know you work with communities of color, but I also encourage you to uplift those voices, work with us, work with the members at Chispa, Arizona. I'm excited for the projects that were talked about today, and we want to continue to work in partnership with the city, but I worry about this bond passing if you're prioritizing investing in fossil fuels, specifically in South and West Phoenix, who have been targeted for years and continue to be so. So please consider that. Invest in trees. It helps my mental health, helps me personally, but it helps our overall community. Thank you all for your time. It's good to see you all.
Our last speaker in the lower council chambers is Chaz Salazar. I'm sorry, the upper council.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chaz Salazar. I am a Chicano flutist, teaching artist, and musical activist from South Phoenix. There are two things that kill Black and brown communities the most here in Phoenix. Number one are the police, and number two is extreme heat. So do not allocate funding for replacing fuel tanks for city fleet vehicles, including police fleets in South and West Phoenix in the proposed fuel tank replacement project. We do not need more money going to the police department, especially funds that are supposed to be for environmental and sustainability issues. Instead, we need this money to go to addressing extreme heat in Phoenix, which disproportionately affects communities of color. Extreme heat and the climate crisis is here now, and we need to act now. We need these funds to be allocated to creating cool corridors, urban greenways, planting of trees. I went to Cesar Chavez High School. I walked that sidewalk without any trees, without any tree shade in this heat. We need that funding to go to electric vehicles and the infrastructure needed to maintain them. The project that should be prioritized urgently and amplified is the heat resiliency project. But for some reason, it's under the future capital needs. And again, extreme heat is here already, and it's now. We need to act now, not wait or delay our actions for the mitigation of extreme heat in Phoenix. We need you to replace the fuel tank replacement project with the heat resiliency project and create and allocate the funding for other projects like it. The way that the prioritization of these projects is listed under those two documents, it's backwards. So the future needs to be current, and the ones that are current should be for future. Thank you for your time.
Madam Chair, that is the last of the speakers.
Thank you. Thank you to the speakers. This concludes our public comment period. Thank you to all who participated. I will open the meeting to subcommittee members for comments and discussion. And just as a reminder, following our discussion, staff will again present on a prioritization process for us to consider as a subcommittee to help us come to a conclusion on the ranking list of priority projects that we would like to put forth to the executive committee. So I can kick this off. From the public comments I've heard, I think investments in our city's top environmental issues, some of the biggest environmental issues on people's minds today, those include air quality, water, and heat preparedness is what I'm hearing. I also have heard several of the speakers and our subcommittee members last time mention that we want to make sure that these investments are equitable and considering all of our communities and prioritizing the communities that are needing these investments the most. And so really putting an eye to equity when we are addressing which projects are going to be prioritized and ranked higher than others. I do understand the city's need to address liabilities in this process, and that is an important concern, and especially an environmental concern when we're thinking about the long-term implications of the decision-making today. It's a tough area to balance the needs of today with the needs of tomorrow. But that's why we have all of these experts on this subcommittee to help us do that. One thing that comes to mind for me with heat resilience in particular, since trees are living and they take time to mature, those investments sooner rather than later are going to be critical as we're seeing the rising heat temperatures across the country. Other cities will be looking to see how Phoenix is leading the way on this issue in particular. And so that for me is something that we should think very hard and critically about. I would also like to hear from the Heat Office on whether or not there are potential projects that are ready to go that are outside of the items that were budgeted on the presentation. In addition, some of the thoughts that come to mind in other areas, are there an additional bucket of ready-to-go solar projects? And this is something that came up in a recent Environmental Quality and Sustainability Commission meeting when we briefed Mr. Tetrol and I briefed the EQSC on the GeoBond process. Solar projects that are ready to go was an item of interest in that subcommittee or in that commission. But I would like to open it up to subcommittee members now to see if there's anything. I guess let's start with the staff presentations, and if there are any specific questions on the information that was presented by staff. I'd like to open it up. Starting with Mr. Tetrol.
Thank you, Madam
Chair. We'll go down the list this way.
Go smartest going this way, right? Anyway, Jean. Madam Chair, thank you, members of the committee. Staff, thank you so much for the presentation. I want to say thank you for the inclusion in discussion with regard to co-benefits and taking that thought and feedback from last time. I was wondering if you could maybe spend a little bit of time on my previous ask as notated in the minutes to understand a bit further about some of the project financing opportunities in the discussion of utilizing GeoBond funds versus alternate or different financing mechanisms. Is things like energy savings contracts is possibly directed towards, say, the HVAC and other energy efficiency components. Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, Subcommittee Member Tetro, yes, we did hear that question and have had a number of discussions since the first meeting to talk about that. And as I said last time, what we do as staff is identify the projects and needs, and then we work with our budget and finance teams to understand the best way to pay for those. So in this circumstance, with regard to the energy efficiency and water savings projects, staff in those departments and the recommendation of the city manager is that we pursue GeoBond funding. However, as I said prior, we are very open to other means and are actively investigating how to maximize the benefits of those. And to the extent that, and I do, of course, Mr. Fazio is here from Budget and Research. We also have Kim Grant from our City Finance Department who can speak very specifically to the thought process behind those conclusions that staff has come to. And so I'll turn it over to Chris.
Madam Chair, committee members, I'd say at a high level, there are different options for funding these types of projects, only one of which is GeoBond funds. Energy savings contracts are potentially another avenue for financing, as is potentially federal funding. So I think it's fair to say that we'd explore any of those funding options. The recommendation here is for GeoBond funds. That doesn't necessarily mean that energy savings contracts would not also be explored in parallel.
Thank you, Chris. And I would like to introduce Kim Grant from our City Finance Department who can speak further to that question.
Hi. As Karen Peters had said, that finance will look at any time an ESCO contract, energy saving contract comes up, we will look at that. The feasibility of that, we've had some in the past that we've reviewed. It comes down to the details. One thing with GEO bond funding, the city has a very high credit rating, and because of that, we can get very excellent rates on our GEO. And in the past, some of the ESCO financing has been more than we could, more expensive than we could achieve with our GEO. It varies by each one. We've also determined it's coming down in the details. Some of the ESCOs will have energy savings guaranteed, but again, we have had ones in the past that we've reviewed, and to be able to substantiate that and get those details in the contract are sometimes a little bit difficult. They don't want to pin those energy savings down that we'll be saving. So we feel that again, and ESCOs will take away from our debt capacity. It is debt, so that does take away from our capacity. So, based on that, that's why staff is recommending the GEO bond funding. With our high credit rating, our good rates that we can get on the GEO, and the fact that every ESCO needs to be looked at because, of course, they're all by different companies and they all have their different concerns and pinpoints. But we're not opposed to looking at each and every one that comes up against us. So does that help?
Thank you, Kim. Madam Chair, or Mr. Titro, as I said earlier, we actively are considering the possibility of other financing, taking into account the concerns that Ms. Grant has identified. But we are very open, and I think anxious to do as much as possible, as soon as possible, to implement these projects because of the benefits that Joe described in terms of energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So we're open to everything. It just needs to work in the eyes of our finance team, and so we're working very hard to evaluate opportunities.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate that, Kim, Mr. Fozzie, Ms. Peters. I appreciate that. I think what I would request is in understanding these take time. I agree the devils are in the details associated with these as well in terms of the performance management of that contract and the associated benefits. I think, at least for my ease of mind, when I look at kind of the total picture from a financial perspective, to understand the highest and best use of that. And I recognize the carrying capacity of the city. I recognize our current bond rating and the cost of capital is extremely competitive, right, as a municipality. I recognize that, and that's a hat tip, I think, to the finance department and the budget department over the years, so thank you for that. I think what would be useful is even having a maybe a little bit level deeper understanding if any of those conversations have earnestly been had, perhaps with any of these either energy savings contract or through the city's procurement office, even just to get maybe initial reactions towards some of this. I don't know if that's an RFQ as opposed to an RFP associated with this, but really trying to understand when we look at the projects enumerated here, I'm curious because I don't know, like, what is the current cost of capital and financing associated with these on a general basis when ESCO organizations might want to do this type of project finance. I've been a little bit out of that game, so I don't know what the current going rates are. But I think even on maybe a level deeper analysis would be helpful to understand what that could be. And then, at least for myself, helps me to understand and then think about recommendations of prioritization of the projects in terms of using the highest and best use of funds. So thank you for that consideration. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Tetrall. I agree. It will help us in thinking through all of the funding that is allocated here. HVAC replacement is $15 million. If we can, find those funds elsewhere or get a better rate elsewhere, we can take that excess fund and apply it to other projects, rebudget it within this proposal. So I think it is critical that we exhaust all options of financing, as indicated by Mr. Tetrall, whether that be through green bank loans, private companies, or even funding through the Inflation Reduction Act if the technology that we are looking at is also located in that Inflation Reduction Act. It might also be a means of considering alternative technologies. For example, have we considered with the HVAC replacement alternative technology of heat pumps? Would that work? If that's something that's outlined as a funding priority area of Inflation Reduction Act, that might be an opportunity. So I think we really need to take a close look at all of the federal funding that is very recently coming through and make sure that's considered as well. So the official request is staff to please take a deeper dive into the funding. Thank you. Next, Ms. Scutari.
Thank you, Chair Torres. And thank you, staff, for the presentation. It was excellent. I don't want to put you on the spot, Dr. Hondulo, but I will a little bit. Based on my comments from the last meeting, I think it's really important to understand how I understand we're really working towards the ROI, the return on investment, financially for these projects. But I also think there's really, the Venn diagram of the ROI on the community and quality of life on these projects. And frankly, we heard from our public speakers today on the life and death situations here as well with the heat mitigation. So I know it's really kind of esoteric, those bioswells. It's a weird word, right? But if you could speak to how it's not just about planting the trees, but it's about making sure there's lush shade that's provided from the trees and that they're maintained and they don't just die on the vine. I mean, we've seen so many situations where we're like, oh, well, what a great attempt to plant 100 trees, but, maybe 5 of them lived, right? So we have a really difficult landscape right now to maintain those trees and create those lush trees and get the ROI on the water savings, as well as the heat mitigation, as well as the energy savings. To Chair Sykes-Torres' comments about what's our ROI there? What's our Venn diagram there? Not just financially, but obviously taking into account the community piece and some of those health benefits as well. So that's kind of a little bit of a intro on, can you tell us a little bit more about those bioswells and so that we, can help the community understand why we should be pushing for those and not just planting trees?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair and Committee Member Scutari. I certainly agree with your question and agree that it is a complex question with many dimensions to try to answer. You are correct that planting trees is the trees themselves really can be thought of as the minority of what a successful investment would be in an urban forestry program. And although it is not detailed yet in the package in front of you, we are increasingly trying at the city to factor in the entire portfolio of costs that could lead to a successful and mature, lush, to use your words, tree canopy. In our American Rescue Plan Act tree program, for example, the single biggest line item is not for plant material, but it's for people who can be trained and serve as neighborhood advocates to see trees in people's yards grow to maturity. We are working with partners like the Arizona Sustainability Alliance, Trees Matter, and American Forests to come up with a more refined estimate on what the costs are for successful tree planting. One of our partners, for example, uses a cost that's about 5 times higher than we had been using historically as the city to think about the investment. To talk about the return side briefly, I also agree that it is a very difficult exercise and there are not robust quantitative economic estimates of the entire portfolio of benefits that we heard the speakers talk about today. For example, the comfort that's provided to a person who's walking to school in shade versus the sun. I'm not aware of an economic estimate of what that means, but I think we heard very clearly today that it is meaningful to the community, and local heat action planning processes speak to that priority time and time again. I'd be happy to try to put together a visual for our next discussion that maybe outlines what we know numerically and what we know qualitatively or descriptively to try to get that bigger picture. But I think we heard from the speakers today, and I've certainly heard over some years working in this field that there is a very high perceived ROI to our community.
Chairman Sykes-Torres, I'd just like to respond to that. So when we look at the benefits, the multiple benefits of something like a bioswale, I mean, that's important for folks to understand that what we're doing is we're actually capturing water that would have run off or maybe flooded somebody's business. And we're capturing it and we're using it then to then nourish and provide that additional water for the trees to be the more lush shade that we're needing, particularly in our transit corridors around our light rail stations, let's say. Someone pushing a stroller, not only they need a really great sidewalk with great lighting, they need that shade to be able to protect them, right? So those are the things that I think we need to also help folks understand, is that this is not just some esoteric technocrat thing. It's like a bioswale installed, let's say, at every transit or light rail station on the South Central line, has the benefit of this much quality of life ROI. So those kinds of things I know are, connecting the dots that you're working in multiple different subcommittees on. But I just wonder if we could just have a presentation maybe at the next meeting of something like that, that if we invested in something like that, these are the water quality, the energy savings, and the heat mitigation benefits.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Subcommittee Member Scutari. I'm getting a nod that we'd be very happy to do so. Our colleague from Street Transportation are in the room as well. As you acknowledge, there are potential stormwater management benefits to these types of investments, and we would be happy to take a deeper dive. We do have some pictures of successful projects from our area and Tucson, possibly in a reserve slide deck that we could take a look at if we return to this conversation as we look for them. The few projects that we are aware of, the several projects that we're aware of, all do have that lush look that you described. It appears that it's been successful. But we are still learning as a city how to do this across the massive infrastructure of our public right-of-way.
Wonderful. And thank you, Keeney Knutson, too, from Streets for that.
Thank you for the questions, and thank you, Dr. Handula, for your reply. I have an additional request for you. If you could get back to us with some specific projects in the area of heat relief, especially those that are related to transit-oriented shade corridors that are either not budgeted already or you're looking for funds for, basically things that would be already in plans that are already approved, that could be easily taken and implemented to expedite the amount of heat relief projects that we have going on in the city. And that could also include green infrastructure, low impact development projects as well. In my mind, it could also include shading bus stops if we could expand that area as well. I see a lot of our fellow citizens that have to walk very far and wait in the sun very long, especially around our sensitive land use areas, those being public hospitals, schools, senior centers, community centers. These are places that those that already exposed, that already have higher levels of exposure to heat illness, have to succumb to even higher levels of exposure when they are walking in these areas and they are not shaded, or they don't, either by trees or by constructed shade too. But I think those are the types of areas in our city that we need to prioritize, and that could be citywide because these facilities are located in all parts of our city, and the people that rely on public transportation to access these public community sensitive use areas, it will make a big difference to that segment of our population. It will benefit everybody in terms of our public health. So if you could take a look at specific projects like that, in addition to, like I said, anything that's ready to go. It sounds like there's some light rail stations in South Central that already have projects that might be ready to go in terms of bioswale projects, and have already demonstrated the success with heat relief projects there as well.
Madam Chair, if I may respond to your comments there and the question you asked earlier, that previously you asked, are there items that are ready to go? And the answer to that question is certainly yes. As one example, in developing the Cool Corridors program, our street transportation department has developed a menu of options across the city where planting can go, and they have a plan over the next several years to hit all of those locations. Funding available sooner would accelerate the timeline to hit those priority locations, acknowledging the time it will take trees to grow, as you mentioned earlier. More generally, we are in the middle of a citywide facility tree assessment using somewhat outdated data as we wait for our new city tree inventory to come in to identify all of those other types of opportunities you spoke to, whether it's at the senior center, in front of a fire station in a highly used area, for example. We are trying to look across the city to understand where every single one of our opportunities is. So we'll be happy to speak to that in more detail next time.
Thank you. Next, Subcommittee Member O'Grady.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, staff, for all of the work that you've put in. All of the information you provided, it will be very, very helpful in helping us make a decision. I realize, I think, just a general comment, we have a really tough task as a subcommittee. We have 5% of funds of the GEO bond. We have to figure out what to do with this $25 million for immediate needs around climate mitigation. It's a very, very difficult task in Phoenix, Arizona. So just want to, within that context, work very judiciously about what we're funding. And I know staff also has a tough job right now, too, with the Inflation Reduction Act and figuring out what all it means. I wanted to pull out Chair Sykes-Torres' comment on heat pumps. I was really curious on the estimates because I noticed there were 10 to 20% range on GHG reduction and also energy reduction. I've seen the EPA on heat pumps say 30 to 70% on heat pumps. And then I also know with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's direct pay as an option for the city for some facilities. There's a few categories. So I know disentangling that is really, really challenging, but it does seem worth it in terms of saving funds within the $25 million. I did want to circle back to Subcommittee Member Tetral, his point on project financing. This is one area where I probably have the most familiarity of the subject matter of the subcommittee. So I ran the numbers for some project financing. I know that the Inflation Reduction Act funded municipalities to actually create green banks with $7 billion. And so then I compared our financing to the Connecticut Green Bank, which is one of the most successful green banks. I used some conservative numbers, and I realized that we do get low interest rates with the bond issue, but I realized it's over a longer maturity. So the interest costs end up being double over the course. And so in terms of the HVAC, in terms of other types of projects that have a quick pay for, it does seem like you have one kind of semi-public options with green banks. Either here, I don't think it has to be in Arizona. We don't currently have one in Arizona. But I think other types of green bank financing could get us a quick alternative method of financing that is cheaper than the GEO bond, even though we have a lower interest rate. There are also other private companies that I know one in particular has worked with municipalities for retrofits. It's called Block Power. They will front the cost of the retrofit and then have some sort of contract finance. You pay with the savings from the general fund over time as you have savings for that facility. So those were a couple options that I wanted to get into because it is the biggest chunk of our $25 million, the $15 million for HVAC replacement. Very excited about heat pumps. I know they work a little differently in a hot climate versus a cool climate, but it still seems like there are significant savings that we can realize. I wanted to ask just two more quick things because I know we're working our way through. On EVs, I realize there's also a lot of federal funding, also in the infrastructure bill, also in the Inflation Reduction Act. I noticed that there's $1 billion for heavy-duty vehicles for cities, for fleets. There's also $5 billion in climate pollution reduction grants that seems like we would qualify. I want to make sure that we're targeting those, but I also wanted to ask if we can help that along with the GEO funds in terms of if there needs to be some sort of match for federal funds that we can support within the project details, the NOFOs for those. And then just last, because I think this is really important, we heard about this today, the gas tank project that seems, it's a relatively small portion of the $25 million, but it seems emblematic of our EV transition, of investing in 30-year assets that are going to be in lower-income communities of color, that you could be cementing in carbon emissions for the next 30 years if we do not make that transition. And so I want to make sure that we're focusing on that. I know EV transition is very difficult. You need a quick refueling time. You need the logistics to work. But how do we fit this in the context of our EV transition roadmap so that we are getting these transition stations up and running and we can have a fleet, especially it sounds like they were lighter duty vehicles that we were funding. And then one last thing on the gas tanks too. It seems like if they are buried gas tanks, they may already be brownfields. And so the function of the funding may not be remediation from this committee. It's just operations. And so if they are already brownfields, then it seems like it should go to another subcommittee in terms of the funding, if it is for operations of another department. I realize I'm not sure, I don't totally understand brownfield legislation, but I would like to know whether they currently, if there was already a gas tank buried, whether they are already brownfields and they would need remediation anyways.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Member O'Grady, we'll get into that and take a hard look and respond to those questions. I don't think anybody here can respond off the top of our heads.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Trying to think how to summarize all of that. I think we've already covered some of the funds. We've already went over kind of asking staff to cover a lot of the funding situations. So I think that's probably covered in our request to staff already. But it was good to re-highlight it. The EV matching for federal funds would fall under that bucket as well. Slightly different area than we discussed before. EV transition roadmap I think would be helpful when we're thinking about the investment in, like Member O'Grady mentioned, the 30-year investment here is an asset to the city for the replacement of these tanks. However, it will bind our city to 30 years of fossil fuel emissions from those assets. And I would like to see, if those are needed for operations and reliability of our city's infrastructure, our public infrastructure, public health and safety infrastructure, it makes sense. But we do want to make sure that we are avoiding stranded assets in the future, considering that the auto industry is converting to EV infrastructure. This proposal would commit our city to more fossil fuel fleets, where we have the opportunity now to think about EV fleets. And so I would like to see the analysis from the city on what that conversion looks like. And it sounded like that's under under preparation right now with the EV, was it the EV steering committee had requested this. It sounds like the city's in preparation of this, but the timing is such that we're making investments now kind of at the same time that this strategy document is about to come out. And so I would like to see more thought and consideration of how this transition will happen, whether it makes sense to be investing in the fossil fuel storage tanks at this time or investing in converting our fleets to EV at this time. Did I get that okay?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I would only add that it seems like there can be some intermediate steps of logistical working in terms of getting those currently internal combustion engine fleet vehicles refueled elsewhere, something in between that is not investing in a new gas tank.
Right, thank you. Now on to Subcommittee Member Edwards.
Yeah, so thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate what the city must be going through. You have the 5th largest city in the world. You are dealing with funding constraints and income constraints and revenue constraints and public perception constraints. So I have no doubt that even if we didn't fund or asked to have removed the fuel tanks, that it's a block and tackle element that you have to deal with. So whether we fund it through the bond committee or not, it needs to get done. Everybody sees where this is going. Everybody hopes we have a greener world, but there are block and tackle things that you're going to have to take care of. And I feel the same way with the chiller replacements. So I know those things have to be done, but what Mr. O'Grady said is absolutely correct, that we have to get a bond passed for this to happen. And to make this happen, there is not necessarily just a return on investment that has to be demonstrated, but a return on perception that has to be addressed. And it's that return on perception that I'm asking you to incorporate in your future presentations as we go forward, the things you ask, because it's important that we come up with a portfolio of projects that we feel warrant including in this bond, that we have to be so judicious in developing that we can move forward with. So when we talk about trees, there is a return on perception. We talk about it's hard to come up with the data like it would be if we're replacing a chiller, right? But there is a return on perception that the public can get behind that's very, very important. So, sorry about the pontification, but I asked this question, I ask it to you directly. If we were not to include the funding associated with fuel tank replacement or the chiller upgrade, it is my perception or my understanding that the city would find alternative methods to make that happen. Is that a fair question to ask?
Madam Chair, committee members, the city has an existing process for review of major maintenance needs and conducts relative prioritization exercises on an annual basis to determine which of those needs are highest based on things like continuity of operations, human safety, et cetera. So absent these projects being funded through this process, for example, HVAC systems that are at end of life would be evaluated through that lens. And where they would score, we couldn't really determine how that would pan out depending on how many, for example, fire life safety systems are at end of life at the same time. So there are alternate funding mechanisms, but there's competitive processes for that funding as well.
Thank you for answering that question. I always hoped that was the answer you would give. So it's back to this overall question. Whether it's the EV, or whether it's the green space, or how we deal with this, this committee is about sustainability in the environment. And therefore, I look for those kind of projects to come forward from this group that really respond to those categories. Understanding that, yes, fuel tanks and chillers are part of the environment. But when we're talking about judiciously putting together projects that we hope to put in front of a slate and have voters vote on it, my request, if it can be achieved, is that the projects put forward fall into those projects that the public could get behind in a very large way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards, for that reminder of our committee and our purpose and our mission to, in the end of this, select projects that benefit all constituents and voters within our city. All right, moving on to Vice Chair Stellar.
Thank you, and I'll echo the thanks of others here, and really thanking staff for the excellent presentation and for addressing some of the questions from last time. I actually don't think I have too much other than I would also echo some of the comments of my colleagues and especially of the chair in asking what shovel-ready projects exist now within the context of heat mitigation, particularly using nature-based solutions, trees, and also with regard to solar, just so that we can at least understand, though, what those. I feel that we're at a. It's a bit difficult now because we have a relatively definite list of the short-term projects, and then we have some potential future projects. But understanding, really what those might be and what are ready to go would be very helpful for us. And I'll just I won't take a lot of time to do it, but I will just again re-emphasize a lot of the comments of others. And I struggle with too, and I see what the city is dealing with here, and I do recognize the very, very significant deferred maintenance backlog that the city is trying to work through. At the same time, I do feel that it is very, very much part of our duty and something that we are compelled to do to really look at the sustainability more generally, to understand how it will benefit all residents more specifically, and in particular, with some of, I do feel that the urgency, it's an unfortunate situation because we have the urgency of dealing with this deferred backlog, but we do also have the urgency of making investments now around some of the other issues, particularly around, again, certainly around the transition to a more electrified future and to one in which we are continuing, and of course the city has a wonderful track record in really being a pioneer around some of the work of Dr. Handula's office and around heat mitigation, and this is certainly an opportunity, I think, to continue to invest in that. So understanding the specifics of those would be very helpful. And then I guess just a question on specifically on the gas tanks, which I think a lot of us are struggling with. One is it would be, I assume that and I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but the implications of a failure of a gas tank, of a leak, I assume are quite catastrophic, but understanding if that's really a likely scenario would be very helpful, or if there's, again, some type of middle ground, such as my colleague asked, around something other than either an operational workaround or something other than a 30-year fixed asset would be very helpful to know if there's any other workaround in that scenario. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Chairwoman, Vice Chair Stellar, with regard to the question about likelihood, just so happens that between the last meeting and our meeting today, one of the tanks that's of the same age and consistency that we are recommending for replacement, not one of the ones on our replacement schedule, it's at a different location, it's at our water service yard, has had a leak and has been taken out of service. So I think our measurement of risk of failure, there is definitely a risk of failure. We've had a few of these now, probably I think 3 in the last 5 years of these kind of age range of tanks. And so in this case, it was the inner wall leaking into the outer space. We don't, of course, know yet whether that outer wall, we think through pressure testing, hasn't leaked, so that's good. We won't know for sure until we remove the tank and see if there's any environmental impact. But there is definitely risk of these systems failing. Certainly understand the complexity and challenges you all face in prioritizing these needs. I just wanted to be responsive to that particular question.
May I just ask a very quick follow-up? So when that happens, is the impact primarily operational, meaning, which I recognize is certainly is not to trivialize that, but is it operational, meaning you just shift those operations to another tank, or is it environmental, meaning there's a some type of environmental harm done because of the leak?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't answer the environmental risk piece yet because we haven't gotten to the stage of tank removal and assessment of the surrounding area to determine if there's been any impact. There is a risk of environmental impact. Thankfully, when these tanks were installed 30 years ago, they were higher environmental protective installations than the previous tanks, where the country had a slew of groundwater impacts nationally because these tanks do corrode and leak, and those were not protected tanks in any way, shape, or form. So we are hopeful that the protective measures that are in place with this tank, for example, will prevent any major environmental harm, but we won't know the answer to that for sure until we excavate and sample.
And just one more follow-up question to that. So I guess in your expertise, would a proposal that includes a tank removal plus EV fleet transition address both the city's liability and the city's transition towards an EV infrastructure? Is that a possibility at this time?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure I exactly understand the question. The fuel tanks.
Let me clarify real fast before you get started.
Sure.
So I guess when I say tank removal, so removing some of these old tanks that could potentially be leaking into the future, we're going to have to remove them when we stop using them eventually, correct? Like
Unless they
after
can
we're
be
done
put
using
to
them,
other
they get
use.
removed.
Yeah, yes.
The remediation includes removal. So we would need funds to remove them when they're out of their use cycle from the city budget or some other funding mechanism. But if that's included, it would address the liability of those tanks leaking, or is it just that they don't leak if there's no fuel put back into them?
Now, let me do my best to respond to that. So there's regulatory requirements that start to come into play here. So we have a year or less to remove, test, verify environmental impact. So we will have to fund. So when Chris mentioned, prioritization things, something like this happens, that would mean this is going to become a high priority project with regulatory risk, and would not be able to fund some other project that the city would like to do because these funds are going to have to be allocated towards something like this. That would be an example. From a regulatory perspective, we have obligations now that kick in to play that we will absolutely have to make sure. So you can't just leave the tank in place after something like this has happened. It will have to be removed. It will have to be tested, sampled, and we'll have to take appropriate action. The cleanup costs won't be known until we know what the level of impact is.
Okay, so my clarifying question is, since we're removing these tanks anyways, instead of reinvesting in them at this time, can we start removing them and also start our transition to an EV fleet at this time? Is the city prepared to do that?
Madam Chair, excellent question, and that's one of the purposes of having Mark here today to talk about the transition plan and what we are doing to accelerate that transition. The interplay between that transition and the fuel tanks, again, it's really going to depend on what the implementation strategy is with regard to particularly light-duty vehicles that are currently internal combustion engine vehicles. As we go through our transition planning, we will identify those parts of the light-duty fleet that are first in line for that transition, make the appropriate investments to get those done. But I think as we indicated last time with regard to police vehicles, it's unclear to us what the transition looks like in the short term. I don't think that really there's anybody who could answer that question. Are we in a position to transition police vehicles within the next 5 years? I think the answer is no. But in the longer term, I absolutely believe that we'll be able to make that transition. And so in this interim, there is a reliance on fossil fuels for those vehicles, and they do rely on the tanks that Joe and his team have identified. So I think they both need to happen, I guess, is the answer to that question. We need to transition as rapidly as available funds and technology allow. And we are committed to doing that, and the mayor and council have been very direct with us on making sure that they're holding our feet to the fire on that. But again, in this transition period, we absolutely do have needs with respect to our fossil fuel fleet.
Thank you. So I guess my request to staff is to answer the question on the police transition timeline, what that looks like. And then also, please look into any less long-term options for the fuel tank replacements. If there's something more interim that would get us to the next 5-year bond period when we can officially translate them into EVs. All right, moving on to Ms. Urian.
Hi, it's Unrine, sorry. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair Torres, and thank you to the staff for all of your hard work. I really appreciate the conversation, particularly around equity and the attention to equity in this morning's presentation. I think that's incredibly important that we really focus on how the residents of Phoenix that for so long haven't really had their communities invested in can benefit from the environment and sustainability portion of this GEO bond. I had a question for Dr. Hondula about the tree equity map and where we're at and where the future capital needs heat resiliency program could take us. I really appreciated the map and the data around where in Phoenix there is sufficient, or not sufficient, but where there are more trees and where we could really, where parts of the city could really invest. And I was just looking at the number of trees that we currently have funding for, and it's exciting that we have 4,000 trees a year that will be funded, and then 5,000 in the next 2 years, 5,000 additional trees in the next 2 years. But then if we need 460,000 trees, that seems like it's kind of a drop in the bucket. So I was curious how close this heat resiliency $11 million that is programmed in the future capital needs would get us to those 460,000 trees. And I also wanted to recognize Committee Member Scutari's comments that it's not just about the trees, but about that broader program and all of the things that go into maintaining that lush canopy. So I'd be really interested in knowing how much closer we would get with that future capital needs heat resiliency program. And I also wanted to just recognize the eloquent comments from our speakers today and just how the future, that heat resiliency isn't something that's a future capital need, but that climate change is happening now and that people are literally dying in our city because of a lack of shade and a lack of sustainability, so that it's not really a future need in my opinion. So sorry for the long question.
Thank you, Chairwoman Torres and Committee Member Unrein. I appreciate the question. With respect to the scale of the possible investment versus the need, I don't have a specific answer for you right now, but I think it is a small fraction. As a point of comparison, the residential tree planting program that we are getting up and running using American Rescue Plan Act funding will invest in approximately 15 neighborhoods throughout the city. And as was shown on the slide, there are 400 that are below the citywide average. That ARPA program is our biggest single injection in urban forestry in our collective memory, and that's going to help 15 out of 400 that are below average. So it is a small fraction. The math that we need to do and don't have updated for you is when we think about those 460,000 needed trees, how many of them would be on public space versus private space? I believe the conversation that we are having here is about public space, which represents only a fraction of the possible planting area in the city. The current estimates are that the city, excluding the mountain preserves, the city has approximately 100,000 trees in the public right-of-way, and that's out of something like 2 to 3 million stems citywide. So the city's percent of the total picture here is small. We can try to get a more precise estimate for you next time, how many of the 460,000 could go in public space, for example, but unfortunately we just don't have the perfect data to answer that question right now.
Thank you. That's really helpful just to kind of wrap our heads around what the impact of that program could be. And I didn't have any other questions, but I do think that there's been a fair amount of skepticism about the fossil fuel tank replacement this morning, and I just would comment that I think it's a really tough ask to come to an environment and sustainability subcommittee and ask for fossil fuel tanks to be replaced, and I certainly have a lot of skepticism around that. Thank you, Chair Torres.
Thank you, Ms. Unrein. I wanted to ask a question of city management. If public-private partnerships are those types of projects can be funded through the GEO bond process. Is that an allowable? Because Dr. Hondula is mentioning that a lot of the trees that we're talking about need to be on city properties or city managed properties. However, we know that our citizens walk throughout the city. They don't just stay on city public property most of their lives. So if there's a way to be able to use some of these funds for public-private partnerships, is that a possibility?
Madam Chair, I'm going to ask Mr. Fazio to take a stab at that, but I think that, again, the devil is in the details. The extent to which public dollars are used for private benefit is a difficult legal question, but I'm going to ask, again, it really depends on the structure of the public-private partnership, so I'll ask Chris to add any comments to that.
Madam Chair, committee members, I would say when looking at a public-private partnership under a GO bond program, at a minimum, there'd be three things to consider. One being the fact that there's potentially gift clause issues that would have to be looked at and worked through on a project-by-project basis. Second, that if and I'll let Ms. Grant add to this if I'm off base, but at a minimum, if the city were to not own the asset, quite possibly we'd be issuing taxable debt, which is a higher interest rate than tax-exempt GO debt. And then finally, obviously the contractual issues that kind of like the discussion you heard on energy savings contracts, that the devil can be in the details on whether we can actually execute these types of contracts. So conceptually, the answer is probably, generally speaking, yes and maybe, but whether it could actually be executed would come down to the details.
So my follow-up is to Dr. Handula, if there are any public-private partnership projects that are out there when we mentioned coming back to us with specific projects, if there are any at the top of mind that might fit into this category that might be approved by Mr. Fazio, please bring those back as well. Moving on to Mr. Adamo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess it's a curse and a blessing coming last. So I don't think I have actually a question for you that will require follow-up work. So that's a good thing. I echo some of what my very, very stellar committee members have said. I guess I'm coming at it from a very different perspective, and maybe I'm oversimplifying the process here, but my understanding is, okay, we have the $25 million that our committee will pull forward. We haven't had a bond election in 16 years, so we are woefully under-resourced in what needs to get done. And I don't think the city is saying that you don't want to move forward on all the green infrastructure. You do. It's just that Mr. Edwards, I think, said it very well. There are some things that just have to get done, and they're not sexy. It's like when we get our air conditioning goes and you spend $7,000. Hey, look at my new air conditioning. No, I want to have new furniture. I want to do a patio. So to me, this is not obvious, but I don't think we have much of a choice. But I realize that the fuel tanks are probably the least popular item for this entire committee, but I just think we don't have a choice, and we're going to come back in 5 years for another bond election, and then we can do more innovative things. Perhaps the name of the committee is doing a disservice calling it environment sustainability, because I agree, some of the stuff we're talking about just seems like the basic things to do. So I don't have a question. I just thank the staff. You handle these questions exceedingly well. And are you all serving the other committees as well?
No.
Okay, well, thank God. But that's it, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I would like to give some time to Ms. Perez, who is a subcommittee member. She's online, if you're there.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Torres. And sorry I couldn't be there today, but I'm homesick with my son. Anyways, I want to echo the comments that Jean just said, because I too feel like when I first got the very first agenda notification for this committee, the first thought was, wow, really sexy subject here. But also it didn't feel very environmentally and very sustainability focused. And that was kind of confused me. But I'm with Jean in the fact that, and Mr. Nelson, these are things that need to be done. They're not sexy, but they're necessary. And like hating on the fuel tanks, I get it. But I struggle with us when some of you that have crunched the numbers, which I applaud you for doing that. I assume the staff has done the same. And I give them props for going through all of this and listening to all of us. Maybe sort of second guess their priority needs from the city, because I mean, I believe that they would know better than I would what is a priority need for the city to continue to function and to serve the people of this of the city. I do just have a couple of quick questions. One was, well, first of all, let me thank the staff again for all the hard work you did and all the feedback that you've been providing, as well as the staff time that I'm sure that it takes for this. And I know that there's been a lot more questions that have come up. Is that even realistic for you to get that to us by the third meeting? And then for us to have a priority list by the next meeting? It seems like a really heavy lift, and I'm just sort of curious about that.
Madam Chair, thank you, Member Perez. Certainly, there are gaps, and we will not be able to provide data where it does not exist. And I think that some of the staff have alluded to that. But there are certainly some questions that we will be able to address in the next meeting, and particular issues that have been raised. So we will do our best to do that. And I definitely appreciate the concern that you're expressing, but we're on it. We'll get good information back to the subcommittee to the best of our ability.
And then just a quick one. This one's for Mark Hartman. Mark, you sounded pretty confident when you talked about the potential funding that is already out there and then potentially coming from some of the federal legislation that's passed. Do you still feel pretty comfortable with us getting up to speed and hit some goals by 2030 with the electrification process for the city fleet?
Yes, thank you, and Madam Chair, Commissioner Perez. For electric vehicles, I think the biggest conundrum or part of this was actually for the heavy-duty electric vehicles is what that submission was for, and that's the one where there's real clarity around lack of clarity around what we will need around either hydrogen or electric or what we'll be needing, and we're certainly piloting those. Our fleet department has kind of got our transit department just got 15 million, I think, or 16 million for piloting up to 18 electric or hydrogen electric buses and others. So we certainly see some funding coming in for the heavy duty to really understand, and I think by the next bond cycle we'll have a really good understanding of what remains for that. And I guess in relation to that, we did hear from the Ian, you mentioned about what percent of the funds, like for covering the core matching funding. We did see as we looked at that, some of the direction was that currently utilities are providing $4,000 per charging station or per charging port, and we actually imagine what the total cost would be, and we could see actually we think utility funds might be able to cover the majority of the matching funds for this, and possibly a little bit else from other things, but certainly we're thinking that the federal funding will be able to provide fully funded EV charging, both for city as well as for community charging. So we're certainly seeing that one coming in around the electric vehicles.
Thank you. I just want to thank the staff again for all the hard work you guys have put in, for all the information and the questions that have been asked of you, and look forward to the next meeting with more information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yeah.
I was holding back on when to insert, but I did want to mention a number of questions, not just on EV, but around the other ESCO projects and things and how that works. When we originally were proposed as staff to talk about the bond funds, we actually looked at what all our projects are that we've identified in parks and in all our public works buildings. And there's perhaps almost $40 million worth of work. And Joe and I had discussions about what are the ones that we want to fund through bond that are most urgent and that would really make the most sense. We actually, some of our lighting upgrades and things, those are very easy to do in other contracts. But some of the replacing really aging equipment was really, these were kind of pulled out and seen as this 16 million is the core ones that would make sense to do more under the bond funding. And we saw some of our other projects that we have identified and actually almost ready to go as far as investment grade audits being done. They actually will be funding through other solutions and other ways, and even in future capital funds that become available. And so this was really just looking at one portion of our capital projects related to energy efficiency. It's most appropriate. For example, some of the cooling equipment, the energy savings aren't that high, but the water savings are high. And I think another one is that it actually is a huge maintenance savings, almost 50% reduction in maintenance for this cooling equipment. And they wouldn't really include maintenance savings within an ESCO contract. That's not appropriate, nor I think you can allow, according to the rules, even include that. So for those particular projects, we really saw most appropriate the bond, and we're really hopeful for some of the other projects as well. There's energy efficiency community block grants, of which will be formula funding, receive a pretty substantial amount, and we're seeing some of these other projects being funded through that. Thank you.
Thank you. And in response to Ms. Perez's comments, I also agree. I mean, these are projects that keep our city running in a healthy environment. And so the city does need to find funding for them one way or another, even though they aren't the most exciting in terms of environmental projects that are out there. But I think what I've heard from many of the members of the subcommittee is, let's fund these projects, but let's make sure that we are exhausting all other options for funding, so that if there are other options for funding that we can find to fund some of these energy efficiency projects, then we can take that extra funding and fund some of the environmental leadership projects, the heat resilience projects that are not on the prioritized list. So I don't think it's a matter of not maintaining our house. It's a matter of doing it in the most economically efficient way, so that we have extra money to spend in areas that will take our city above and beyond in terms of environmental leadership. Before I go to staff on prioritizing projects, I do want to, since we all went in a row, I just want to see if anyone has any burning last questions or commentary on kind of what they've heard as we've moved along. And I see Mr. Tetral.
Madam Chair, thank you. Staff, thank you for this. Again, another riveting discussion, a lot of peppering of questions. You've done a great job. Big round of applause to all of you. I think, when I also look at this, and I've heard some very interesting commentary in terms of taking a multi-pronged approach, right? Not just from a savings perspective, but understanding, say, the GHG impacts, risk, community health, environmental health. And I recognize that it's hard to blend all of those together. And I recognize as well that things like a fuel tank replacement, while important and a very pertinent point of discussion today, I don't want that just to be a proxy for us focusing singularly on that and not having a holistic orientation towards that. So with that, maybe my feedback in council here is I'd prefer to not frame this as a false dichotomy, right, as an either or, tanks or no tanks, right? I think, and by no means will I speak for my esteemed colleagues, that there are probably certainly areas from higher risk capacities, exposure for human health, environmental degradation and catastrophe that could be prioritized. But I think hearing some of the feedback with regards to maybe the financial instruments, the community impact, the non-data or financial economic ROI, potential co-benefits associated with this, then when we think about it in a sustainability kind of holistic perspective, maybe there's a blended approach, right? So again, I don't want to think of a dichotomy that has it choose with or against solely on the premise of whether we, judge those facts. If there is an area of gradation where there might be contemplation and consideration of this body for things like fuel tanks, but in addition to that, right, hearing some of the things that we've heard, I would invite you to take that under advisement. Thank you.
Other committee members have any final thoughts or questions?
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. O'Grady.
Just one quick comment. I think the really exciting thing about this subcommittee is that we do have a choice, and that in terms of this maintenance that needs to happen, when you replace your air conditioning, when you replace your car, you could buy a heat pump. You could buy an electric vehicle. And so I think that's really what we're trying to get to here, is not that none of these functions don't need to happen. That's not, I used to be a city employee. I realized they are critical functions. These cars need to be refueled quickly, but that there are, with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the new technology, the EV technology is getting very, very, very good, and we need to keep up with that, and these could be stranded assets if we don't move fast enough. So that's just one point I wanted to make, that yes, this is blocking and tackling, this is home maintenance, but we have a lot of options.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? All right, I would like to turn it over to, let's move the meeting along to talk about the prioritization projects, prioritization and ranking process. So as a reminder, our task is to develop a rank order list of projects and priorities for the executive committee. So staff have indicated that they can assist us within the subcommittee by facilitating our subcommittee's discussion going forward. So I will turn the meeting over to staff to discuss that process now.
Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. I'll wait for staff to share the presentation. So as this committee approaches the halfway point of its work, we thought it was important to talk about milestones and next steps and how we get from here to subcommittee recommendations and some thoughts that staff had on how that can be facilitated. So to recap, the executive committee's direction to subcommittees is to identify the highest priority needs for this bond program that cannot reasonably be deferred. Now, it's important for the public to be aware that the subcommittee's recommendations don't mark the end of that process. The recommendations will go to executive committee, who will continue to hear public feedback and have their own thoughts on recommendations, and then ultimately going to city council, again, who will hear public comments and have their own thoughts on recommendations to voters. This subcommittee has 2 meetings after today to develop and finalize recommendations. In order to come to a recommendation, the committee will need to first determine the list of projects that will be evaluated. So as a starting point, staff has the results of the capital needs study. We're hearing concepts on tree planting, bioswales, maybe adjustments to heat resiliency projects, but really defining what that list is that the committee would like to evaluate. The committee will need to rank order those projects. In some cases, as I believe I've heard references to, the committee may want to propose an increase or a decrease to project costs identified by staff. So in the case of this subcommittee, there are several projects that have been identified that are what we'd refer to as lump sum projects, like energy efficiency and HVAC savings, where the amounts could be increased or decreased. And finally, the committee will need to determine which projects are not going to be moved forward to the executive committee. With there only being 4 meetings to complete this work, the next major milestone for this subcommittee will be identifying the list of projects, which will need to occur no later than the end of the next subcommittee meeting. Once the total population of projects is settled, the subcommittee will then need to work through relative priorities and costs. There isn't a prescribed method for how the subcommittee will come to its recommendation. Staff have set up an optional process to help facilitate this decision-making. This would look like a survey ranking tool, a SurveyMonkey survey, which involves ranking by individual committee members. This would be done independently by each committee member. The results would then be compiled at a summary level and brought back to the subcommittee at its next meeting as simply the starting point for the subcommittee's deliberations and recommendations, coming into the meeting where individual members stand in terms of their initial perceptions of relative priorities. That's something we can do between this meeting and the next meeting. If the subcommittee were already at the point of identifying the projects to evaluate, or it's something that could be done between the 3rd and the 4th subcommittee meetings. Again, this is a completely optional process, but if the subcommittee would like something as a starting point, as opposed to open deliberations, it's a mechanism for doing that. So with that, I can take any questions, or if there's a desire for additional information on that, I can go over that as well.
Thank you. So just to clarify, by today, you would like us to identify as subcommittee members the universe of projects that should be that our subcommittee would like to consider for prioritization. Is that what you need from us today?
Madam Chair, that could be done at the end of the 3rd subcommittee meeting.
Oh.
If the subcommittee is already at the point today of being able to identify that universe of projects, doing so and proceeding to a survey would allow the subcommittee more time for deliberations. But that survey could occur between the 3rd and the 4th meetings or between the 2nd and the 3rd meetings. Okay.
3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4th meetings. Okay. 3rd and the 4 Do we have any questions? Subcommittee members? Sounds like we still might need some data from staff to determine the projects that we may want to consider, given that we've asked for some information from Dr. Handula in particular.
Madam Chair, I would agree with that. I think that having a little bit more analysis and detail with regard to, as we've asked some of the, the soft benefits perhaps, but also some of the, if there are additional econometric analyses that could be brought forward again in terms of financing structures, et cetera, that regardless of the projects themselves, I certainly think as we have to determine what the projects are, but then if we want to then, via this online tool, which I would advocate for personally, Mr. Fazio, I think it would be useful to speed up discussion as a starting point, would help us then from the rank prioritization perspective.
Sounds good to me. Any other comments or thoughts from subcommittee members? Are there any questions from staff? And I guess we can come back to the next meeting, and we can, after we hear from staff, we'll be able to define the range of projects a little bit more in detail. Otherwise, I don't know if there's a tool that's involved where people can submit kind of their official ideas in writing before then, or have you guys kind of thought through this process of how the range of projects comes about? Do we need specific heat projects if we want to consider that as a subcommittee moved up, for example?
Madam Chair, I would say with respect to that very specific point, the heat resiliency item is a program.
Okay.
It does not have specific projects within it. And so I don't know that you need that in order to elevate it if that's the desire of the subcommittee. But of course, you've requested some information and we'll be happy to come back with that. But the heat resiliency item is a program, a bucket of funds that would be allocated to projects that staff.
Madam Chair, I do actually want to kind of comment on that.
Okay, one second. So for example, we asked for more information on solar projects, solar ready to go projects. That would be something that was not listed in the booklet before under the prioritize or the future. So we would need that information. So would that come back to us as kind of a package where we can include it, or?
Madam Chair, so one of the things that we need in order for a project to get ranked and recommended to the executive committee is some more definition around what that project or program would be. Staff does need to do some analysis regarding costs, whether it impacts operations, and so on. And so I'm turning again to Mr. Fazio to confirm, but without some very specific definition, I think it would be problematic to add it. But if there is definition, then certainly it could.
Okay, Ms. Guttari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's actually a perfect segue into my question. So if we were to have an idea, I know generally it's a lot of right-of-way costs and things for a bioswale, but let's say we were looking at the general range of costs to install bioswale on a light rail station. Let's say under construction right now in South Central, Broadway and Central. If we had an idea of all the costs associated with that, relocating utilities, right-of-way costs, working with something that's already in construction and coordination, the actual installation of the bioswale, installation of the actual landscape materials, those things. I mean, are we talking about, is that $500,000? Is that $1 million? I mean, if we had a range for that, or something that's already constructed, that would be a different, I'm seeing a head nod, which is great, but, that already is constructed, and that we would have to retrofit that area for a bioswale. And I understand a lot of the challenges, right? We've got water lines in all the wrong places for a bioswale installation. Relocating a water line, I mean, we have an expert here in Karen Peters on water, for sure. So she could tell you the challenges of relocating a water line. However, if we were looking at that installation, what is the range of a cost of a bioswale? Because then I think we could understand, instead of this general term, what we would be looking at. Thank you. And to the public-private partnership piece, it's not necessarily about us gifting the public or the private from the public. It's about the private gifting to the public in the sense of contributing the right-of-way or contributing the cost from a public-private partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gutari.
Madam Chair,
Yeah.
just a question, just a clarifying question. So are there two options that we'll look at? One would be there's a total of 6 projects that we have that were identified for current and future, but then we're talking about maybe adding some ones that have not been fleshed out yet. So
Yeah,
are
we're
those
talking
two
about
options?
the process for how you would propose adding one to be in the ranked prioritization.
That wouldn't be like, it wouldn't be under the heat resiliency program of 11 million.
I mean,
might
it
just
seems
be
like it could, because, Ms. Peters, go ahead.
Sure. Madam Secretary, to your question, with regard to the green infrastructure, low impact development, bioswale development, we do see that there's a possibility that that could get incorporated in the heat resiliency item.
Okay.
Would affect the overall funding level allocated to that. With regard to solar projects, there is nothing currently before you with regard to a solar project or projects or program. And so in order for that to get considered by the subcommittee, we would need some significant new information. But and so that is going to be a little more challenging.
As I understand, the city may have already undertaken feasibility studies for city solar projects. And then in addition, I believe that in the Inflation Reduction Act, there may be additional opportunities for funding publicly owned solar projects. So if that data could be looked into, that would be appreciated. One more request. Looking at the list of projects, we've talked a lot about the prioritized projects. We've talked a lot about a few of the future capital needs projects, those being the EV projects and the heat resiliency. We haven't heard a lot about the city brownfield redevelopment projects on the future capital needs. So if in the next meeting we could hear a little bit more about what that entails, especially if that entails some of the redevelopment along the riverfront area, I think that would be interesting and a good opportunity to convert brownfields to greenfields. It would benefit the city economically, business development, all of that good stuff, and provide open space opportunities. So I would like to hear more about that potential opportunity in particular.
Madam Chair, I have a request.
Yes.
So in terms of the EV bucket, I'm very much in general in favor with the proposed projects to do buckets and to give you all the discretion you need to implement this funding. I'm curious on the EV transition bucket, if we could get more information on if this committee were to allocate funding to EV transition, how much are we hastening the EV transition process, or is it more we're blowing in the wind with all these other market and federal funding sources?
Madam Chair, regarding that, there's certainly specific projects that we could identify, as well as general funding that we could have, like a pool of funds available to, if we're purchasing an EV and we need to provide EV infrastructure, we could have, here's what a pool of funds might look like for that. So we could come up with some specific ones if that would be helpful.
I think that would be very helpful in terms of especially fleet transition, making it vivid for us of what this means, because I think private is important in terms of private EV use, but in terms of mileage and emissions, fleets are also, or maybe even more important.
If I may, just to chime in, because we have, I would say, insufficient clarity on what we're going to have access to from the federal level, we could only maybe do that with an assumption that there was no federal funds and these were the only funds available to us, because otherwise we really don't know. I mean, one of the major challenges we all faced in the EV program as we pulled this together, was we're expecting that there may be opportunities from federal funding, from working with utilities, but we do not know what those opportunities are. And a major challenge along the lines of, with respect to the EV, we're all, I think, in the same place, which is this is coming, we want to get there, we want to get there as quickly as we can. We have several challenges, though, that are real, which is our power infrastructure and its capability in supporting the transition. You know, I can't be in a position where we're buying vehicles we are not capable of effectively charging at our facilities or in our community, which right now that would be the case if we were to go and can we even get the cars, but if we could get the vehicles, can we even, you know, charge them, right? So you have to kind of build towards this, which is, I think, part of the reason why when, you know, this didn't rise to the level of a prioritized recommendation, we just didn't have a lot of information, and we still kind of are in that place. And I think we'll be for a little while. The NOFOs aren't completely out yet, so we don't completely know, but we could undertake an effort to give you an answer to that question, making the assumption there's no other funding available and this is what we can get.
Mr. Director Guides, I think, yeah, a very conservative estimate of assuming nothing else happens, what can we fund, what could happen, I think would be a great like baseline to work from, because we're expecting they will get cheaper, there will be support, but that may not be till 2025.
Madam Chair, just one more point of clarification. Yeah. So are we asking as a subcommittee the staff to add a more thorough look at solar, for example, and adding something brand new to this, or are we still just looking for the bioswales can go under the heat resiliency? I'm a little bit concerned to add something brand new to your plate when we have all this information coming at us for things that are kind of been talked about. So I just want clarity on that.
I agree. Would solar fit under any of the existing buckets?
Madam Chair, as currently configured, no. The buckets are, there's equipment replacement for energy efficiency. There's I would say no. Looking to Mr. Fazio, he's the one who helped put all these together to see if he disagrees.
Or was it something that was studied that's in the report that just didn't make it to the prioritized or the non-prioritized project, or the prioritized and future needs projects? Is it somewhere else in the report?
Madam Chair, I'll defer to others as to whether solar was looked at as a potential item to add. I would say that in terms of the projects that are in front of the subcommittee, one option could be to adjust the scope of one of them. So I'll just pick on the energy efficiency and water savings project. Conceivably, the committee could adjust the scope of that to incorporate the flexibility to add solar.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for that clarification. Does that answer your question? Okay. So I think moving on, we are almost out of time, I believe. So based on today's discussion, the ranking order is an optional process for our subcommittee. So it sounds like most committee members are in support of using this ranking system in the future for our prioritization.
Madam Chair, could I ask a clarifying question
yes.
to Mr. Fazio? Mr. Fazio, I assume that that's a public record vote as well. Is that correct? When we're asked to provide that initial feedback in terms of prioritization?
Madam Chair, committee members, yes. We would be aggregating the information just, frankly, for purposes of efficiency, aggregating the information into summary level data. But yes, individual responses would be public record.
Thank you.
And that means individual responses could be open to a public record request, just to clarify. So thank you to all staff and subcommittee members and the public for participation in today's meeting. Before we wrap up, do any subcommittee members have requests for our next meeting agenda that we have not already discussed? I feel like we've had a lot of discussion today. I think we're clear on that. I want to remind our viewing audience and subcommittee members that the public hearing that is scheduled for the GO Bond Executive Committee is on Wednesday, September 14th of this week at 6:00 p.m. This will be a hybrid meeting, so residents will be able to participate virtually or in person, and more information is available at the Phoenix.gov/bond website. Our next GO Bond Environmental Subcommittee meeting is scheduled for September 22nd at 9 a.m. And subcommittee members, please notify staff in advance if you have a conflict with this meeting. The meeting is adjourned.
Those who are struggling to pay their city services bill. Another option available to customers is no interest payment arrangements.
Our only goal is to maintain operations and infrastructure so you and your family have access to safe, clean, and affordable water and wastewater services. For more information on financial assistance and recovery programs, visit phoenix.gov/water.